Welcome to this special Celebrating Philanthropy event. I think most of you know me. I'm Susan Phillips, Professor and Graduate Supervisor of the Master of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership. This event marks the 10th anniversary of the MPNL, and we're very proud to have both the 10th cohort and now the 11th cohort with us during the Summer Institute. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Carleton University is situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. As settlers, as immigrants, as their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of our locales and hope for a more just future together. For this special anniversary, we focus on philanthropy in a global context. When we started the MPNL, we recognized the need very quickly to build international connections with centers and programs around the world. We knew we had much to learn from them and engage with them, to get known as a new program, that helped, and to conduct student exchanges and even joint programming. Most recently, we've hosted a joint course in philanthropy in the SDGs with the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. It was thus very appropriate that we mark this anniversary with a discussion on philanthropy in a global context. Canada has much to learn from practices, both positive and negative, in other countries, and to consider how Canadian philanthropy might be distinctive in many ways. And we also have innovations that we might provide to others. So as we turn to the panel, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Jennifer Conley. Jennifer is the Chief Advancement Officer at Carleton, a leader in professional development, an alumna of the MPNL, and the instructor of our course in fundraising. And I am now going to excuse myself to sit down as a member of the panel. In all the 10 years we've done this, I've never actually been a panelist, only a moderator. So I'm turning that role over to Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phillips. What an assembly of esteemed international experts, thought leaders, dynamic researchers. It's just so extraordinary to have this group together. Thank you. Now, you look like a very bright group, so I will not go through the biographies at a lengthy manner because I bet you've done your research and you've already checked out all of their experiences in education. But very briefly, starting from my right, Charles Sellen, PhD, Global Philanthropy Advisor and Instructor, Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership, Carleton University, Canada. Dr. Charles Sellen is an expert, scholar, and advisor in global philanthropy, affiliated, of course, with Carleton and Philab. He previously served as the inaugural Global Philanthropy Fellow at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and a Fulbright NGO leader visiting from France to the United States. Charles has conducted research on philanthropy since 2004 at the intersection with international relations and global cooperations towards development. Charles has a Bachelor in Political Science and Business, a Master in International Economics, and a PhD in Economics. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Carrying on, Michael Moody, PhD, is the Frey Foundation Chair for Family Philanthropy, the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy, Grand Valley State University, USA. Michael Moody joined the Johnson Center in 2010 as the Frey Foundation Chair for Family Philanthropy, the world's first endowed chair for family philanthropy. In this role, Michael pursues a comprehensive international program of applied research, training, and other activities to lift up family philanthropy. Welcome, Michael. Joining us online, Diana Leat, Philanthropy Advisor and Associate Centre for Philanthropy and Public Good, University of St Andrews, Scotland. Diana had some challenges joining us. Oh, there you are, Diana. Lovely to see you. Diana has held research posts in universities and think tanks in the UK, the US, and Australia. Having spent some time focusing on research into grant-making foundations, Diana spent a year with the Carnegie Trust in the UK, developing the first research centre for philanthropy in the UK, CGAP. Diana has served on boards of various foundations, including the Diana Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. She is the author of over 120 articles and books on the nonprofit sector and social policy, specializing in philanthropic foundations. Most recently, Diana co-edited a book on philanthropic response to disasters with Susan Phillips and Alexandra Williamson. Welcome, Diana.
Sorry, I can't see you.
Keratiloe Mogotsi, PhD, Lecturer and Program Director, Center for African Philanthropy and Social Investment, University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. Kara Mogotsi is a pracademic, researcher, Lean Six Sigma coach, project management professional, and lecturer. She is the Program Director for Executive Education at the Center and also a lecturer on African philanthropy at the University of Witwatersrand's Witt School of Business. She holds a PhD in African philanthropy, and her research areas include disaster philanthropy, venture philanthropy, African philanthropy, and philanthrocapitalism in Africa. Welcome, Kara. And finally, in the club chair, not at the podium, so lovely, Dr. Susan Phillips, Professor and Supervisor, Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership, of course, Carleton University, Canada. Susan Phillips is a professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration, and of course, founder and supervisor of the Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership graduate program here at Carleton University. Susan's research focuses on public policy and regulation of philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, financing charities and nonprofits, cross-sectoral collaboration, community foundations, and place-based philanthropy. She's currently researching models of cross-sector leadership, the responses of foundations during COVID-19, and strategies for enhancing the financial sustainability of Canadian charities, among other research projects. And she's also the policy lead with the Charity Insights Canada project. Dr. Phillips is a sought-after speaker, lecturer, researcher, and commentator, alongside her very active teaching duties. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay, so now is the time where we unpack some issues and perspectives from our esteemed panel. What we'd like to draw upon in this conversation is drawing upon your particular experience, your particular expertise, and perhaps your particular geographic perspective as well. We're going to move on to these opening remarks, as we call them, and we've limited the dialogue to about 6 minutes so that we can leave time for a moderated panel. I'd like to start, please, with you, Charles.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to share some of the key trends of global philanthropy, and maybe first try to explain what global philanthropy means, because we often use that term, but as my neighbor has contributed to define philanthropy generally, but for global philanthropy, sometimes we don't provide a clear definition. So a way to understand it could be, first of all, maybe comparing countries with each other, understanding what are their domestic environments for philanthropy from a political standpoint or tax standpoint or cultural standpoint. And another way to look at global philanthropy could be measuring the flows of money that transfer from one country to another. So it would be more a quantitative approach, looking at outgoing flows or incoming flows, which we may term cross-border philanthropy. So there are plenty of ways to approach that idea, and it's always important to go into a little bit of definitions prior to answering the question. But now let's go to the point. What would be some of the key trends? A first trend that I noticed is that the United Nations and the global development community are taking philanthropy seriously now. It's been quite recent because for a number of years, private initiatives and public bodies were not mixing with each other too much. But in recent years, there has been a convergence movement. And since 2015, the United Nations officially calls on philanthropists and private foundations to help meet the Sustainable Development Goals that are supposed to be met by 2030. So we are halfway on the road towards 2030, and philanthropists are actively sought after by UN bodies, entities, and agencies. So that's a very strong trend. Another trend would be that all these global actors now share a common language, which they call the Sustainable Development Goals, and that has a lot of implications on the ideas that they're discussing and the metrics that are using to assess if we are performing well into reaching these goals. And perhaps those 17 SDGs may be seen as a matrix, a sort of common matrix for a proper dialogue between private and public nonprofit actors for the global good. But of course, this matrix has limitations because if you put one topic or a group of actors in one box, it will not fit in another box, and sometimes people don't fit in any box. So it's also a limitation to have this matrix. But at least it offers the opportunity for having a common ground, a common language, common references. Another trend that is clearly distinguishable is the digitalization or dematerialization of charitable flows from a cross-border perspective. You all know that now we have plenty of mobile apps and digital technologies to transfer funds from one place to the other, and it's much simpler than it was in the past. So we can do all sorts of wire transfers, web payment, online giving, and with technologies that a lot of us have heard about but do not necessarily understand fully, like blockchain, artificial intelligence. We covered that yesterday in the course, and it was very tough to understand actually the intricacies of artificial intelligence. We've heard also about crypto giving, crypto donations, e-wallets. There are plenty of new technologies, so that's a big emerging trend. And lastly, I would talk about the power of diasporas, because we live in a very diverse world, and many people are living in countries that are countries of host countries, and they're different from where they were born, and there might be through them an interesting connection between countries of origins and countries of where they live, or the host countries. And I think it's important for fundraisers, for nonprofits, to rely on those communities because they can establish very fruitful international connections.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charles. I can't believe that. Oh, yes. Round of applause. This is the best lecture I've attended all year so far. I can't wait to keep going. Michael, please, let's hear your perspective.
Yeah, I'm gonna pardon me if I look at my phone so I make sure I don't talk for 20 minutes because there's a whole lot to talk about. When we talk specifically about, I'll focus specifically on the U.S. And some trends happening there. I guess the first thing to say is that there's, the fact that we're having this conversation about global philanthropy, and that, and because, for better or worse, the U.S. has always been where people, read a lot of news about philanthropy, and when Mackenzie Scott does something big in the U.S., you hear about it all, and so the fact that I'm one among many people talking about the trends in philanthropy, I think is itself a really positive trend. We're to this point about global philanthropy. But I'm just going to talk about two broad things, two big broad trends in the U.S., and then we can always in the conversation have a whole conversation about a whole lot of other trends. But one is, just in general, the first one is a trend around what I think of as decline. It's not wholly decline, but it is, I think, importantly an element of decline. And the second is about change. So the first trend in decline is that, in a nutshell, there are fewer households, significantly fewer households in the United States who do traditional giving to charity. Up until this year, and I'll talk about that in a second, the pie of giving, the amount of money given to charity in the U.S. has continued to go up, generally in line with our GDP. But the number of people who say they give to charity has gone down. And so the general message, of course, is if the pie is growing and the number of people contributing to that pie is going down, then it's the Mackenzie Scotts and others like them at that top percent that are giving more and more of that pie. And so I think the decline, so just numbers, I'll give you a few data points on that. And then I won't go into why we think that's happening, but we can have a conversation about that. So a few data points. One is, we know from research done by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy that if you look at when they follow the same people in this longitudinal study, representative sample of Americans, and they're giving to charity, in 2000, about two-thirds of these households said that they gave to charity in some way. By 2018, it was one half. It had gone down below one half. For the first time in history, it was below 50% of households say that they contribute to charity. That's a dramatic change. That's you take 5 households in the U.S. at the turn of the century, and you look at who gives to charity. One of them will have stopped giving to charity by the time 18 years later, and that trend seems to be continuing. A lot of other reasons why that, but that's what's going on, and this is true across all racial, ethnic categories. It's especially true about younger households. So it's a big concern. That's the decline. There's a group that's been pulled together in the U.S. called the Generosity Commission to try to look at how to resolve this and fight it with national conversations and research. And one of the things they just put out was a study that people still feel that they're generous, and most of the people who they talk to still believe that being generous is an important part of being a good human, and that they themselves are generous. It's just that giving traditionally to 501c3 in the U.S. is the category, or other traditional NGO charities, is no longer the primary or even the main way that they go about being generous in the world. So it's almost this redefinition of what it means to be generous, and the field really hasn't caught up that much. And they also, when they look at the conversation about philanthropy, they see a conversation about celebrities and about big donors, and they see critique about philanthropy. And so for them, that doesn't connect to their own personal, everyday neighborhood generosity or other ways. And so it's partly change in that sense, but it's really decline in traditional, what we used to think of traditionally as giving. The other information is from Giving USA. Every year there's an estimate of the amount of money given to charity in the U.S. By various individuals, foundations, bequests, and corporations. And for the fourth time in the last 40 years, it went down from 2001 to 2002, because it's always a year lag. And so the report just came out a few weeks ago. And that's really tied to the economy, we think. There's a lot of other reasons, again, we can go into about reasons for this, but there is and that includes Mackenzie Scott and Bill Gates and the divorce giving and all the stuff that people are happening at the highest end that we hear all about. Still, giving overall has declined, and if you account for inflation, it's 10% decline year over year in giving. So no longer is it just the regular households that are declining in their giving. Everybody is declining, and people in the U.S. really just are trying to figure that out. And I think that's a big dynamic, and one that we can talk about what it means. The second one, also there's some research about most people don't understand philanthropy. There was a survey just asked how many people understood this. In the U.S. we have this rule about 5% payout for foundations. And if you asked a random sample of Americans, a ridiculously small number of people know that there's any sort of limit on foundations. It's really the awareness of philanthropy and grant making and other things is incredibly low in the U.S., and that perhaps contributes. And then really fast, with 1 minute left, the second trend is one of change, and we could talk a lot more about what this means, but there's always been, and when I say change, I'm focusing particularly here on the blurriness of the boundaries of what we mean by philanthropy and what we see and count as philanthropy versus what looks more like business or what looks more like a relationship with government. Those boundaries between those sectors have always been a little blurry. There's always been a little bit of government funding of nonprofits, and there's always been, Goodwill that runs a market mechanism to feed its program, all these things. It's not as though it's a brand new idea, but it is so much more significant in the last decade than it has ever been really historically, and it's happening in there's a lot of tremendous examples of how it's happening with government in terms of, in my state, current state of Michigan, foundations literally bailed the city of Detroit out from bankruptcy by paying the pensions of public workers, a distinctly governmental thing to do, to pay pensions of police officers and firefighters, but foundations came in and did that as a way of solving. And a lot of other examples like that. And in the business blurring is what you hear about all the time. The charitable LLCs like Mark Zuckerberg started with his wife when they decided they didn't create a foundation, they created a for-profit entity that was still charitable. We promise you it's charitable, but it's a for-profit entity. And a whole lot of other things. There's this big, huge, the most popular TED Talk on charity by Dan Pallotta is a TED Talk that tells people that philanthropy should operate like business. And if you don't give anything to the cause, if you raise a lot of money and don't give it to the cause for a few years because you're building your brand as a charity, that's not too bad, because that's what Coca-Cola does, and that's just fine, because businesses have it right, and philanthropy and nonprofits just to be more like business. Those things are going much more dramatically than they ever have in the past. And just finally, to give you a historical marker of how different it is, if you look back in the 70s, there was this thing published by Milton Friedman, the most famous free market advocate in the world. He wrote this op-ed in the New York Times Magazine that said, the title of it was, "The social responsibility of business was to increase its profits." So this whole idea of CSR and social responsibility was, for him, antithetical to the whole idea of capitalism and probably going to destroy capitalism. That has completely turned the other direction. You can't not be socially responsible and be a corporation today. So that's another blurriness. And then the other thing that happened, if you look at the first time, when you use your credit card and they say 5% will go toward, dealing with forest fires in Canada, or, your pink M&Ms and fair trade coffee and all the things where these charitable things are embedded in consumer. We call it ethical consumption and all the things we do now. Millennials and younger generation are very much into it. When the first company that tried that was Amex back in the 80s. They called it cause-related marketing, and there was some tiny percentage of every Amex transaction, 0.01% or something, was going to go to causes, and there was this huge backlash against it. It was cynical use of charity to try to get more money. We've completely flipped that, and so the future is going to be this blurry boundaries, and we'll see where it goes. Excuse me. Thank you.
Michael, you made repeated invitations to unpack during the question period, so I can't wait to unpack some of those provocations. Thank you for that. Diana, we see you. You're so far away, but we feel like you're right here with us, hoping that you could please share your remarks, trends, what you're seeing, your perspective. Over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I truly wish I were with you. Newark Airport was never on my bucket list, and it's definitely off it now. 4 hours at Newark Airport is enough for anybody. Nothing against Newark, but I'm just saying. I wanted to first of all congratulate Susan and Carleton on the 10-year anniversary, because, in my experience of nonprofit academic centers, they come and they go, and 10 years is a major achievement. I'm actually at the moment doing some work with James Allen Smith in the US, and we're looking at the way in which philanthropy in the nonprofit sector has been debated in the post-war years. And as a sort of side issue to that, we started looking at the development of the field as an academic discipline. And even the greats of all time, the Pompos and so on, they didn't last. It's a really tough call. So Susan, hats off to you. Congratulations. Having said that, what do I want to say about UK philanthropy in the UK? Well, first of all, there's an issue about language. When I first started working in this sector, we didn't, in the UK, talk about philanthropy meant high-end giving. That the word has since been democratized, I think, in not entirely helpful ways, actually, because it just means that we then have to make some other distinctions about what sort of giving by whom we're talking about. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about foundations and the nonprofit sector more generally. The honest answer to the question, where is philanthropy in the UK at, is all over the place. Because, like many other countries, we have a very uneven distribution of income and assets and so on. So 86% of nonprofits control 13% of the, 13% of nonprofits control 86% of the income. So what the organizations that we so often talk about are actually totally unrepresentative of the sector as a whole. However, I want to just reflect on some of the things that we talk about now that I think we didn't talk about, say, 25 years ago. The first would be, there's been a really noticeable trend in the UK, which was partly a product of the pandemic, to wanting to do more flexible, trust-based funding. How long it will last, and whether people have actually thought through the real implications of it, I don't know. But there's a sort of move, there's a group of about 40 odd funders who are trying to galvanize support around that. The second area of change, I think, and this sort of picks up on some points that Michael was making, is about the cost of living crisis and inflation, the effects of that on giving. We also have declining giving. It's picking up a bit, but it's still not at pre-pandemic levels. I think what is actually equally interesting is that we have growing recruitment problems in the nonprofit sector. And we also, for the first time in my memory, have strikes. And I think that is a very, very interesting, possibly indication that those trends that I was certainly part of, maybe some of you were too, of the sort of marketization of the sector, that we are now going to live with some of the unintended consequences of that. If working in the nonprofit sector ceases to be something that you feel good about and that you do for the money, then we've got a problem. Interestingly, actually, the cost of living crisis in the UK is terrible, and it's obviously having an effect on demand. It's also having an effect, we suspect, on giving, and it's interesting that one foundation has actually decided that it will give a no questions asked across the board 10% increase to all its grantees with income below £1 million. But that's one foundation. How many will join them, I don't know. The third, and possibly many ways the biggest area of change, is the amount of time and effort that goes into discussion of DEI. I mean, it's not new. I would happily give you a quote from an Anglo-American conference held in 1972 at Ditchley, where one of the issues that they see coming up in 1972 is the need to get more young people and Black people onto boards and involved in nonprofits. So it's not new, but it's of a very different order now, and it's a particularly hot topic in relation to governance. And there's now a number of foundations, I can't remember what the tally is now, have found up to something called the Foundation Practice Rating Scheme, which rates foundations annually on measures of diversity, accountability, and transparency. And I'm very happy to say more about that later. As you might expect, real progress, as far as we can gather, towards DEI is very patchy, and there's some fairly depressing data on exactly how far we've got on that. But I think it's interesting, the governance versus the staffing, and then, of course, the grant allocation. Those, you need to unpack all of those. Another trend, and I realize I'm running out of time already, is nonprofits have traditionally enjoyed a very high level of trust. That is no longer the case. I don't know whether you're familiar with the Olive Cook story, but this was an elderly woman who gave to, I can't remember how many charities, 20, 30 charities. And it turned out that charities, surprise, surprise, had been selling data between each other, and she ended up committing suicide. Whether she committed suicide as a result of the pressure put upon her by charities is, I don't want to comment on that, but it led to a new fundraising regulatory body, which I think many charities would say, sigh and say, oh, another bit of bureaucracy and interference and so on. But actually, I think it gives the general public a route to flag up their concerns. And it's very interesting. They have been tracking the effects of AI on disaster giving and disaster giving scams. And I think that the fundraising regulatory body will prove to be a very worthwhile investment. Then there is, just very quickly to finish, there are some old chestnuts, collaboration. I think the sector is much more collaborative than many people think. And I think maybe it's time to have a debate about when collaboration isn't really a good idea. I mean, the sector has always, part of its raison d'etre has been its diversity and its plurality. Well, if we're all going to start collaborating, what does that do? The other thing I think we really need to sort of be honest about is that it's very nice to talk about the sector as the glue of society, but actually the sector both contributes to and attempts to combat polarization. So it's the glue, and it's the whatever the opposite of glue is, the solvent. And the final point I'll make is that one of the other trends I see among foundations is that, I never was completely convinced by the old grant-making operating foundation distinction. And, people like Stefan Topler have written about that. But I think today it is even less rigid, and more foundations are doing more things for themselves. So I'm sure I've overrun. I'll finish there. Thank you. And Susan, again, really sincere congratulations.
Thank you, Diana. We're seeing common narrative with some wonderful peaks of interest and some provocations intensifying. And Kara, I wonder if you can contribute to this momentum that we have, please, around nonprofit sector, philanthropy in a global context. Is it glue or solvent?
Thank you, Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank all the students here, the faculty members, my fellow panelists, and Prof. Susan, who's my host, for having me. So I'm so happy that you said we should share our experiences, because I love a good story. So those who've watched The Gods Must Be Crazy, it's a very old, have you watched it? Yes. It's a very old film, and if you haven't, please do. But I felt I should open with that because the whole film is about what a Coca-Cola bottle did to a community of Khoisan people in the Kalahari. So they were living in the Kalahari, have never seen other people outside of their community. And then one day, a pilot dropped a Coca-Cola bottle, and it landed in their with these people. So they saw this thing, and it was fascinating at first. They realized how versatile it is. You could use it to grind your food. You could use it to mix things. You could use it to dry snake skin. So it was a good thing at first. But it also introduced something that the Khoisan had never known and felt before. There was now a sense of lack. The pilot only dropped one Coca-Cola bottle. And because there was only one in a family of 60 or whatever they were, only one person could use it at a time. So there were now feelings of jealousy. There was now envy, like, oh, you have the bottle and I don't have the bottle. There was corruption and colluding, like, oh, how can I take the bottle whilst that one is sleeping? And stealing as well, to steal the bottle when it's not your turn. Very foreign concepts that were unfamiliar to the Khoisan community. So anyway, the whole movie is about how the leader decided to take this bottle away because it was causing a lot of harm to the community. In a similar breath, the term philanthropy is a foreign concept in Africa. It's our Coca-Cola bottle. It does bring feelings of envy, of lack. Oh, you have, I don't. How can we try to make sure I get ahead of another cause? Like, how can you decide I'm going to feed you and not feed you? So that's what it has brought. The reason why I say it's a foreign is that it's not the way that we operate in Africa. So we have our own philanthropy. We do not call it that. We can't spell that word. We can't say it. But when you explain to any African who hasn't even been to school that it's about helping someone or giving someone, then the bells will start ringing, because that's what we do. We don't go to school for it. You don't get a degree for it. It's in your way of being from the moment that you're born right up until the end. So if I grow up with you in a community, I do care what happens to you. And when I become well off, I come and stay here in Canada and I'm well off, I'm never going to forget home. I will be sending money home. I will be sending support home, because that's what we do. That's how we roll. So what has come up within the African context, I want to leave you with two main headings. So we do have our own structures and what I would like to call developments as well. Structures in the sense that because we have our various over 3,000 languages, we do have expressions of giving that are in the African languages as well. You may have heard of the term Harambe. Anybody? That means pulling together. Ubuntu, which means I am because you are. It also comes in various different languages as well. And we're now shedding the light on those concepts. We're now shedding the way of light on those ways of doing things, because that is intrinsic to our cultures. And it doesn't matter whether you go to East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, you will find the same concept. So we are now shedding light on African ways of giving. We are now creating our own structures of giving as well. So we are changing the narrative as well. So Africa is not that image where you imagine a child with a ball asking for food and how hungry they are. Who defines hunger? Who defines poverty? In the same way that before that Coca-Cola bottle came, did those people know that they needed the Coca-Cola bottle, or that they needed this thing to be able to grind their goods? They were living, they were able to survive with what they had. So now that we have these definitions of poverty, of inequality and all of that, and foreign aid coming in to be a hero, we've realized that, you know what, we need to shed light on how we help ourselves. We need to shed light on how we share risk and reciprocity, solidarity, and the care that we have for one another. It's so deep to the extent that even when something happens to our brothers and sisters, you remember the Haiti earthquake, right? It was devastating. We don't know those people, but we could see fellow Africans that were in distress. So communities in Kenya sent cattle. I mean, that's what they had. They sent cattle. And nobody advertised. They just said, what can we do? And they contributed those resources to be able to assist people in Haiti. So we are now doing our own research on African philanthropy. We have scholars. I'm one of the first graduates at our university that focused on African philanthropy, but there's 23 others that are also working on their PhDs and documenting stories from different African communities and how they help themselves. So I'm giving it 5-10 years maximum that African philanthropy is the new kid on the block, firmly making its mark, redefining things and redefining mutual support. It's not a matter of I'm Bill Gates, I have more, I'm going to assist you, but I'm Keratiloe and I'm helping you, Susan, as well with your research or whatever it is. So we're shedding light on that mutual support and reciprocity, which is the essence of African philanthropy. There are many organizations that have been formed as well. I wrote so many of them here, but we are creating a social entrepreneurship, social innovation type of attitude, because we realize that the funding space is shrinking. So if it's declining in the US, you can imagine how much it's declining in Africa as well. So in true African spirit, we're finding ways to still try and survive and do the things that we do through social enterprises. So doing social innovations, but finding ways to earn revenue in creating that social impact. We also have this enemy, this big enemy called climate change, and it's very real, and we are not even the ones that caused it, right? So we don't emit carbon. What's carbon? We don't emit carbon emissions. Well, it's very, very little compared to what's being done in other big economies, but it's affecting the African people a lot because the weather patterns are changing. You can't plant your plants the way that you always do. It's supposed to be rainy season now. It's hot. During the rainy season, the rain is not coming. It's coming later than planned. So that affects families and food security. So this big enemy has also created a drive and an interest from African people themselves to find ways to get back to our indigenous systems, to get back to ways that people then were able to survive, so that we can infiltrate it in our farming practices today. We can infiltrate it in the education as well today. So institutions have been formed and are also funded by Africans themselves. Africans are doing very well. So you've got some doing well in sports, you've got some that are doing well in the mining sector or minerals, which is what we have in abundance. So when they become successful, because of the nature of their African nature, they are also creating foundations and giving back to the communities, not only where they come from, but other African sectors as well. So we are slowly the new Bill Gates of the...
Thank you, Kara. And Susan, last word to you, please.
Well, Canada is both the same and different, particularly similar to the U.S. Kind of things that happen in the U.S. eventually waft northward, unlike smoke from forest fires, where we send that south, and from the U.K. The similarities are that the overall rate of philanthropy, the rate of the participation in philanthropy is declining. The overall pool of the value of philanthropy is still increasing somewhat because of large gifts. They may not be quite Mackenzie Scott, but they're large. We're newer on the scene in those bigger gifts. We're probably a little bit quieter about them. Canadian philanthropists haven't been quite as celebrity level as in the U.S. And we're similar in that the rise of donor-advised funds, so that now 1 in every 10 charitable gifts goes to a donor-advised funds, which are the realm of the affluent. That may be changing the distribution of philanthropy. We're still on the early edge of finding that out. And it may be amplifying questions about the legitimacy of philanthropy. Again, we're lagging a bit behind in the US, but the question of assets sitting there, the credibility, all of those are becoming more pertinent, more sharply asked questions than in the past. And I think one of the things we need to do is to make sure that critique of philanthropy, which in part may be justified, but that it doesn't go so far or so blindly or so one-sided way that it undermines the very positive in philanthropy. I'm going to focus on a couple things. One that haven't been mentioned yet. One is the role of women. Women are changing philanthropy in significant ways. As they acquire wealth in their own right, as they may be their surviving spouses, and evidence suggests that they give differently. They are more likely to be engaged, to support advocacy causes, to be more engaged in international work, and we look to a forthcoming report that some people in this room are involved in. And importantly, we're seeing leadership transitions. We're seeing that in nonprofits aging out due to demographics, and that churn that Diana talked about. We're seeing it in foundations as they become more professionalized, growing staff at all levels. Many foundations have long been professionalized, but many, even given their asset size, were seriously under-professionalized, and we're seeing that change. And importantly, we're seeing a new cadre of younger leaders who don't think the same way, they don't act the same way as their parents and their grandparents, much more interested in systems change, in justice orientation, and they're bringing a new diversity, equity, and inclusion to leadership positions. That may not be happening as extensively and as quickly as we would like, but it's certainly happening, and it's having an impact. And therefore, we're starting to see systemic changes in philanthropy itself that is interested to a much greater degree in changing systems of all kinds. For those of you who were in 5002 this morning, we heard about the work of the Foundation for Black Communities. I think that's a game changer. It's a game changer of doing things very differently, engaging with community and being responsive, and simply throwing out the old ways of philanthropy that were much more institutionally and donor driven in the past. We still have some significant work to do. We have to deepen and broaden a culture of philanthropy, and think of that in different ways. We need to pay much more attention to public policy for philanthropy in that regard, and I think we need to do much greater investment because of some of that leadership change, that professionalization, in talent development, in understanding the trends. And of course, I'm an academic. I'm going to make the case for more research. But the scale of the change that is upon us means we need to be much better at understanding, on unpacking, and learning how to be out in front, or at least keeping up the pace with a deeper knowledge and understanding of what's happening and its implications.
Thank you so much, Susan. So the narrative develops. I have notes on something that each of you has mentioned in your own particular perspective and in your own particular jurisdictions. I'm wondering if we could unpack a little bit about the decline in overall household giving. There's been some name dropping of Bill Gates and Scott McKenzie, et cetera. So with some outliers, I'd like to talk about cause, but I'd also like to talk about solutions. I'm very well aware we have the future of the nonprofit leadership sector here in this room. So if we can talk about what's going on, what happened, what brought us to this point, what can we do about it, folks? What can we do? Michael, do you want to start us off, please?
Sure, so much to say. So a few things about, the first thing to say about why we think giving is, at least I'll say this in the U.S., but I'm sure there's similar dynamics in Canada and elsewhere. We don't know exactly why, but we have a lot of very good ideas, and there's some evidence for most of them. So one is, and they all primarily come back to the sense of the economy and people's sense of their own financial situation. So I should say that the recent decline, this just a couple weeks ago data, foundation giving actually went up, even though it didn't go up as much as it had in the past, because that's so tied to the stock market and other financial things. But I think so. There's obviously historic amounts of wealth concentration happening, and that's squeezing out the middle class in various ways, and below the middle class as well in terms of the amount of giving that the amount that they feel like they're able to have. In the U.S., we have also student debt, which is now becoming significant for young professionals. If you track student debt in the U.S., it's just gone exponentially out of control. So people just don't feel like most people in households that are not Bill Gates households don't feel they have resources to give. And so they'll still answer the questions like I mentioned, where they say, I'm generous. I was generous during the pandemic, but it might have been in mutual aid kind of things. I mean, in some ways, the sort of thing that we're talking about, mutual support, this idea that you help neighbors, that if I have, you have, and all of that, that's, I think people continue to see that's, they're still generous and they see themselves as generous and they get meaning in their lives by being generous. But they don't have the finance. In fact, that survey that I mentioned where the people asked people why they didn't give, the vast majority said they didn't give because they didn't feel like they had enough money. So I think that has to be the most important thing. And big giving when big giving declines, it declines a lot because of fluctuations in the economy and the stock market. But I also think there's some things the religiosity has continued to decline, and religion has always been tied to giving because you're asked to give all the time, if not of other things, right? And you're also told that your belief system tells you to. That's declined. Social trust in general, we've been tracking that for years, has declined, and less trusting societies have lower giving. And I think I've done a lot of research on the next generation of donors and how the next generation thinks about. My most recent book was on this, and they genuinely, when you ask them how do you want to do good in the world, they still want to do a lot of great things in the world. They're just as philanthropically minded, to use our favorite term, as other generations, but they don't think of writing a check to a nonprofit as the first and primary way that they're going to be generous in the world. They want to be more involved in politics and activism and organizing. They do crowdfunding. If they have resources, they want to do that because we talk to a lot of people with significant resources in the next generation. They see the good that they can do through impact investing as perhaps way more impactful on the world, changing capitalism, than the impact they can have through their giving. And so there's all sorts of other ways. Lucy Bernholtz, a scholar at Stanford, calls it the giving scape. The giving scape is much more like the landscape of opportunities that you have for collaborative giving or crowdfunding or helping neighbors or whatever that might be. There's so many more available to you, or ethical consumption that I mentioned before. And I think the field of the research on philanthropy is facing a crisis of redefining how we measure doing good in the world. And I don't think anybody has a real good answer for that yet, but that's not going away because the next generation is super excited about that. So we got to figure it out.
Thank you, Michael. Kara, has this been your experience as well in terms of causes, solutions, et cetera, in your experience?
I think there's a limitation in defining giving monetary only, because also giving of resources, giving of time is something that's very much anchored within the African communities. COVID was a very, very difficult time for everyone. So you found that the assistance that came, I mean, we do get a lot of Western aid, mainly from the US, but US was also having problems with COVID. So they had to withdraw some of the funding. Some NGOs lost 80% of their funding because they also had to attend to the US context. So without that financial support, you found that the non-financial stuff was equally important. So providing the time to be able to assist with the massive reaction to COVID that happened, but also communities, it was a stressful time as well. Communities were not fully understanding the whole concept of COVID, and you found that it was the civil society organizations, those community-based organizations that were helping with the education, that were helping with awareness raising, not giving them money, but helping them with the information, because not everybody has a TV on and following the news. So helping them with the information so that they can be able to help themselves. And I find that even to this day, because I mentioned climate change earlier, right? Even to this day, a lot of the impacts that come out of that, it is the non-financial support that helps people to survive. It is that education and awareness and the advocacy resources that are put into it by ordinary people, not just big foundations, that help people to survive and to thrive as well. And to gain resilience, it is a form of resilience building as well, that's been able to assist African countries. You're all surprised how we survived COVID, right? It was because of these this care, this mutual support, and these undefined systems that are not recognized in the global philanthropy space that actually works to be able to assist people. So I think some attention to the non-financial side of things as well.
Thank you, Kara. Diana, you talked about government oversight as an intervention. What other solutions? I'm not saying that's a solution, actually. I'm leading the question. Here we go. Diana, talk about future state. What can we do about this decline in household giving, which has had various causes? What interventions, what solutions might you offer?
I'm actually, Jennifer, fascinated by the idea that we slip into so easily, that more money leads to more good and less money leads to less good. I mean, that that requires some quite big assumptions there. And if tomorrow the giving rate doubled, would we all sit back and say, "Oh, happy now, it's okay"? I don't think I would. And do we really want more Bill Gates or Mackenzie Scotts? I just think we really need to, I think other people have said it in different ways. We really need to start to examine the assumptions we make about the role of money in the achievement of a better society. So ways of increasing the rate of giving would not be my number one priority. My number one priority would be to actually think about the way that we spend money and the way that we allocate all sorts of other resources. And in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, I think we spend way too much time talking about processes and much too little time talking about roles and relationships and values. So no, I don't. Intervening to increase household giving is not something that keeps me awake at night.
This is the kind of conversation you can only have at Carleton University and really discuss and probe and be provocative and have a different view. Diana, thank you for that. Tremendously valuable to changing the conversation, which perhaps we will do with one final question for the panel, which is, and again, I've led the question by saying you can only have this conversation at a university. Yes, I'm biased. But what value do the research centers bring to this dialogue about philanthropy? Again, the kind of debate that we've had already, we have differing views, and I see that at our reception we'll have more, which I can't wait. Is that the value of the research? What else is the value of the research? Why are these centers important in our public discourse? Love you to unpack that, please.
I'll start with that. It matters because evidence matters. Evidence changes perceptions, changes conversations, can change behavior, and it changes public policy and professional practice. And those who are working in operational charities and even in foundations rarely have the opportunity to stop and gather evidence in a deep way and to mobilize it. And I think that's our distinctive role. I was particularly pleased when we were invited by the organizers. We're in the process of founding and trying to get significant funding for the Foundation for Black Communities, that we could collaborate in that in providing evidence about existing patterns of grant making and being able to put a number on that, a percentage of a proportion on that. It drew back the curtain on what we probably might have known, we didn't pay attention to in any serious way, and it made visible the invisible. And I think we can do that on so many other things. We talk about all of these big trends. What implications will they have? What implications 10 years down the road would a really serious decline in philanthropy, whether it's giving or whether it's engaging in volunteering? Can we be prepared and anticipate that? And who's going to do that work? And I think that's part of the value of what we can contribute.
Tremendous. Thank you, Susan. Kara, Michael, any further thoughts on the place for research, the research centers, which you represent here tonight?
It's like asking what role does a referee play in a match? You cannot run the match without the referee, because research centers are a neutral sort of party. So we don't, our center is the very first and the only of its kind in the African continent. But we play like a neutral role because we're able to engage with corporates, we're able to engage with the nonprofit sector as well. We're even able to engage with governments and assist them with data, assist them with information to help them with decisions. So corporates want to know how can they socially invest. They want to know, like, what are the big issues, what are the trends? We get that question a lot. So through the reports that we do and the data that we provide, we're able to share that with them, and it helps them to make data-driven decisions in terms of how they invest. Nonprofits also want to know, oh gosh, we are having shrinking funding space. How can we mobilize resources? How can we think about our community foundations, etc.? Again, we're able to play a role there because all our research is centered on the nonprofit sector. Governments are also interested because they are the authorities of countries. So sometimes it's difficult for them to be able to run the country, make effective policies that will benefit people because of all the dynamics that we face. The world has been through a lot in the past 10 years alone. So again, we're able to provide or share those conversations and discussions with government. And would you prefer to engage with the research center or some corporate organization? Obviously the research center, because the corporates have their motives, they are in there for business and there are things that they seek. So we are the referee in this field, and I think it's a very unique position that's very essential to try and get the sector going forward, but also social work and social impact going forward. So you wouldn't play a match without a referee. A research center is very important, yeah.
Thank you for the analogy of the referee. I will never forget that, Kara. Thank you. Michael, Charles, final thoughts? The value of research, the value of the centers, yes. Please.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's important to have research at the domestic level and also at the international level as well, because obviously we live in a globalized world, or some say global village, and if we have a growing body of literature on philanthropy over the past 20 years, the literature on global philanthropy per se is still quite scarce, and we need to fill this gap of knowledge. Especially beyond what we term the weird countries. So this acronym is often used to depict like the Western, higher educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries. There's been an interesting publication about this. Like, how do we understand the concept of philanthropy in a non-Western centric way of thinking? I think it's super important because there are different manners of understanding generosity, charity, altruism in other cultures worldwide. Well, given the number of disasters that humanity has to cope with recently, I mean, like wars, pandemics, forest fires, and all sorts of catastrophes, I think we observe people respond massively with generosity, all sorts of generosity, not just monetary, but also giving time, talent, ties, and testimony, as we've seen in the course, the 5 T's. Well, it's important to cover that and to get data, understanding, and just to conclude also, it's important to have a global effort in research and teaching, because nobody's going to be able to solve those problems alone, like no single actor, no single state, no single foundation or philanthropist. So there's a need for more collaboration, and this collaboration also has to take place in research at the international level, I think.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk more about the teaching side than the research side, and and maybe I'll talk about it in a what for me probably is a deeper sense of connecting to our humanity. So the decline in regular everyday folks giving, household giving, does keep me up at night, but not because I'm worried about more that I think mostly about money coming into the field, and although that is a concern, because if households give less to giving, then each nonprofit that's trying to raise money has to depend more on the most elite donors, and they become more beholden to the bigger donors rather than others. But the primary reason I worry about that is because I think philanthropy is a fundamentally important part of being human. What we think of as philanthropy, it is as important, if not, in my sense, I would believe, more important than governing ourselves properly or managing our market transactions in such a way that we raise the wealth of our communities. It existed before those, and it will hopefully continue to exist. But if we don't pay close enough attention to it in our institutions of higher education, or even earlier than that, if we don't allow people to explore this part of themselves and this part of the human experience, and this part of every single human society that we've ever known has had some version of people voluntarily contributing their own resources, their time, their talent, their treasure. Now we add ties and testimony, the 5 T's. All of those things that you can give philanthropically, that's fundamentally part of being human, and it has been since we started being human and coming together as societies, and we really don't spend nearly as much time in education talking about, learning about, and of course learning research about that part of the human experience. And so I do think, and there's also this threat that the more, with blurry boundaries, the more that people think about, I'm going to do good in the world by starting a B corporation, or I'm going to get a job at a triple bottom line company, or I'm going to go work for this government institution. There's something about that's threatened to the philanthropic, that this fundamental part of being human, and I think we have to teach it. We have to engage with it as in our institutions of learning. And if we don't, it potentially could wither a bit. I don't think it'll ever go away because it's part of being human. But we can definitely neglect it, and I think that's the danger. We need more centers and degree programs to not let it wither.
Well, I think our panelists have just made a case for support for our future center or school of philanthropy. I think they've made it very compellingly, too. I thank you for that. We'll have time for 2 questions, and I'm thinking for equity, we have a microphone there. We can take 2 questions here, and I know we'll be having questions and answers during the reception as well. Questions from the floor are welcomed. Does that mean we want the reception early? We have our 2 posers. Thank you.
I can't resist. I've been writing questions the whole time, thinking if there's an opportunity. I'm Christine Troutmansdorf. I'm the Executive Director of Volunteer Ottawa. So we're one of the about 150 volunteer centers that operate throughout the country, doing that time and talent gathering and redistribution that funders and philanthropists look after on the treasure side. Yesterday we did a webinar in honor of Welcome Ottawa Week, which is sort of welcoming newcomers to Ottawa. And we called it Cultures of Giving. And so we had newcomers or people who had lived through the newcomer experience talking about their experience of volunteering, what it had brought to them and their reflections on it, but particularly picking up on their home countries or their home cultures and the contrast, the very structured, to Diana's point, sort of very process-oriented volunteer culture that we have probably in North America and the Western world. And there was Vietnam, the Philippines, Kenya, and an indigenous, North American indigenous culture. And every one of them spoke very much to the African, echoed that it's just part of community. We're not individualistic, we're communal. It's just expected, it's just what you do, and if you don't do it, you're voluntold to do it, because that's part of being a human being, to someone else's point, I think Michael's point. I'm curious about, we're running a little nonprofit, so we look at funding, donations, we look for corporate sponsorships, we look for government grants, and then we look for foundation grants. Those are kind of and then the social enterprise, the self-generated revenues. And we spend an inordinate amount of time working on that versus doing the good work that we want to do. I'm interested about the relationship between philanthropy and governments, because essentially governments they collect money from taxpayers, they set priorities that are supposed to kind of meet society's needs, and then they redistribute. And if all our funding came from government that had been democratically elected, that would simplify my world a whole lot. I'd just be interested in kind of the relative merits of philanthropy and foundation work versus governments doing that job.
Thank you for your question. Who might like to take that one? Kara. Diana, would you like to? Kara is saying she's yielding the floor to you if you'd like to go first, and then we'll have Kara.
Thank you. I mean, just very quickly, a wonderful question, and it goes absolutely to the heart of the things that I think we should spend much more time talking about. Sadly, I think the small amount of writing there has been of late on the relationship between philanthropy and democracy has been, it's badly rehearsed some very old arguments, and we really need to have that discussion. It's urgent, it's so important, and we can go on. It goes back to the point about we can go on talking about processes endlessly, but until we know what we're here for and what the relationship between the different sectors and responsibilities and so on are, then we're just wasting time. So, great question. Yes, please.
Yes, please. Thank you, Diana. Kara.
Yeah, so that's a sensitive one in Africa, because some governments, you say democratically elected, and there's debates, are you really democratically elected? And the role of government really is to govern the country. So they are the boss. So or technically speaking, they're supposed to be the boss. They're supposed to be providing the public services and all of that. But governments care about the votes at the end of the day, right? So if they want to stay in power, they need to attract people's attention so that the people vote for them after the 4 years or the 3 years of tenure. Corporates, what do they care about? You actually wrote this in your paper, Prof. Susan.
Did I? Good for me.
Corporates, what do they care about? They're there for business. They're there to make money, to sell their product or their service, and to make money for it. So philanthropy is in a unique position in that you are not democratically elected. So you are not under pressure to gain favor with communities so that they vote for you. you're also not under pressure for people to buy your service or to buy your product. You don't have a market share issue that the corporates have. So what that does is that philanthropy then has this unique position in the flexibility of how to assist people. And government can use philanthropy as a tool. Or while in Africa, you actually find that philanthropy is doing basic services. So things that the government is supposed to be doing, you find philanthropic organizations just existing to help with water or electricity or something, basic things that the government is supposed to be doing. So philanthropy becomes a tool to try and assist some of the things that government is not able to do or incapacitated to do. If you think back during COVID, and this happened in America, I know, I saw it in the news, government was also struggling with the fluidity of COVID. Today it's like this, tomorrow it's like that, and then you find the philanthropic sector in its flexible nature, ability to quickly come in and step in where the help is needed, come in and sometimes provide the services where government is not able to. So there's a love-hate relationship, though, I must say. They would, if any of us were from government, I don't think they would say all beautiful things about philanthropy, but the two of them need each other because philanthropy has that flexibility that government doesn't have. I hope that helps.
Very helpful. Thank you, Kara. Final question in the formal period of our evening, please.
Thank you for this panel. I'm Robin Hugendam. I'm currently the Manager of Policy and Research at Women's Shelters Canada, and I wanted to ask about trust-based giving that Diana mentioned. I'm just finishing a study of the labor challenges across the women's shelter or anti-violence sector in Canada, and people are constantly saying one of the biggest challenges they're experiencing is their relationship with funders, the fact they're not trusted, their expertise isn't understood or valued. And so we're seeing a few foundations, I think here in Canada, Diana mentioned a little bit in the UK, where trust-based giving has popped up, but is that just a post-COVID sort of moment in time, or is that a trend we might start to see more widely?
Thank you for that.
I think it's a trend we will see more widely. We may overhype how much it is happening at the present, but it's changing because the old ways don't work, whether they're government as a funder or whether they're a foundation as a funder, where you determine the priorities without asking community, where you set all kinds of accountability arrangements that create externalities in terms of administration and funding that ultimately leads to precarious work. And if we're really interested in using philanthropy as a vehicle for social change, we have to think of different ways of doing that, of which trust-based philanthropy is one way. So we're going to see more innovation, more risk-taking in ways of doing things. And partly what we need to do now is to understand what works and what doesn't, to share that learning so that we're not constantly reinventing different ways of doing things, find out that doesn't work, let's try this, but we can actually learn from each other in the work that is going on.
Thank you, Susan. So to properly frame our conversation, we'll end on sort of one statement about philanthropy in a global context. One thing you'd like us to remember, hold tight, think about, reflect upon maybe, and talk about in the reception. Diana, can we start with you, please? One thought, rapid fire.
Oh gosh, that's tough. I think I would just reiterate my point that I want there to be more discussion about roles and relationships, and maybe rather less, well, not less, but I want that to be equal with any discussion of process. The other point I would make is that I think we need to be much better at understanding our history. We think we're doing things that are new. They're not new at all. And, you know, they didn't work in the past. They probably won't work now, but we could tweak them if we understood more about our previous experience, which is huge.
Thank you, Diana. Closing remarks, Charles?
open my mic. Yeah, I think philanthropy should basically bring us together. And I see that in a lot of the debates that are going on in the sector, it increasingly separates people because we have so different views about what should be done, what should not be done, who's right, who's wrong. But in the end, the whole idea, if we go back to the original meaning, is that it's supposed to be something that brings us together and helps us be kind to each other. So that's what I keep in mind all the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Michael, how about you?
I'm tempted to talk about government because we have it so figured out in the U.S. We're doing it so, we're just killing it in our democracy at the moment. I will just say that, my rapid fire version is philanthropy is absolutely essential to every society, and we don't know nearly enough about it. And so we need vastly more research and teaching on it, and that's even more important as philanthropy becomes even more significantly global, as we're realizing that philanthropy has always been global, but there's so much more research to be done on philanthropy in a lot of other places around the globe, and international philanthropy itself. So we need more. My punchline is we need more research.
Thank you for your punchline. Kara?
At the end of the day, we are all human beings, and it doesn't matter where you come from, what language you speak, which government is in power. We all want the same thing, and that is to be prosperous in whatever prosperity means in that context. So we've only just scratched the surface of trying to see how philanthropy can play a role in that. For people to be prosperous, because as long as we don't want to dictate that philanthropy means people have to be poor and unequal so that we keep helping them. We all have to be not poor, we all have to be equal so that we don't see philanthropy in that role. However, we've only scratched the surface of trying to really understand the contributions and the roles of philanthropy. So I would encourage all of you who are coming into the space and doing your scholarly research on it, just go and see how else it's looked at. Go and see how else it's defined. The lady just now asked about trust-based giving. What does that mean in different contexts? What does that mean here in the Canadian context? We've only just scratched the surface of that research. So I also call for more research, but I also call for helping people to help themselves. Let's not leave this definition and this narrative that it's only about the rich helping the poor. Let's also look at people helping each other and people learning how to help themselves.
Thank you, Susan. Final word.
Fundamentally, philanthropy isn't about money. It's certainly not about charity. It's really about citizenship. It's about how we as citizens in a civil society treat each other, how we grow as individuals, but most importantly, how we deal with each other. And therefore, I think it needs to be better understood, it needs to be protected, it needs to be amplified, and that is why it is such a delight to have the students in the MPNL who are going forward as leaders making change. And we're indebted to you and to what you will do for the future of this field. We thank you in advance.